The morning Caroline died, I promised her I'd keep the lake house exactly as she left it. 3 years later, standing on the porch that she'd painted sage green because it reminded her of her grandmother's kitchen, I wondered if she would have understood what I was about to do. The October sun slanted through the oak trees, throwing shadows across the deck boards I'd laid with my own hands 32 years ago. Every plank had been chosen carefully, every nail driven true. Caroline had sat in her wicker chair, 8 months pregnant with David, directing me with gentle corrections. A little to the left, Frank. The boards should align with the porch rail. She was particular about lines, about things looking right. Now the chair sat empty, though I'd kept the blue cushions she'd sewn, faded but intact. Sometimes I'd pour 2 cups of coffee out of habit, setting one beside it before remembering there was no one to receive it. I was holding my second cup when the gravel crunched in the driveway. The sound carried clearly across the water. We'd chosen this spot for its acoustics. Caroline used to say you could hear a car door slam from half a mile away, which was perfect for knowing when David was sneaking home past curfew. The black SUV was unfamiliar, too new, too polished for our country road, but I recognized my son's profile through the windshield. The way he sat straight-backed, hands at 10 and 2, like his mother had taught him. Behind him, I could see other figures, his wife Madison. And in the back seat, 2 heads of silver hair. My chest tightened. David hadn't visited in 18 months, not since the Christmas when we'd argued about money. He'd needed $15,000 to cover some business investment gone wrong, and I'd said no. Caroline would have lectured me about helping family, but Caroline wasn't there to mediate anymore. The car doors opened in sequence, like a choreographed performance. David emerged first, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Madison followed, her blonde hair arranged in one of those effortless styles that take an hour to achieve. Then came Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents, stepping onto my gravel as if they owned it. I'd met them exactly 3 times, the engagement dinner, the wedding, and one strained Thanksgiving where Patricia had criticized Caroline's stuffing recipe loud enough for the whole table to hear. Gerald owned some kind of consulting business and had a handshake like a vice, the kind men use when they're measuring you. Dad, David's smile was bright and empty, the one he'd perfected in high school when he needed something. He climbed the porch steps with the confidence of a man who expects doors to open for him. "You look good, rested." "David," I stayed in my chair, coffee mug warming my palms. "Didn't know you were coming up." "Surprise visit." Madison's voice carried that carefully modulated tone she used at dinner parties, smooth as silk and just as artificial. "We brought my parents to see the lake. They've heard so much about it." Patricia ascended the steps like she was inspecting a property she might purchase. Her eyes swept across the porch, taking inventory of the mismatched furniture, the paint that needed touching up, the wind chimes Caroline had hung because she liked the sound they made in the evening breeze. "It's certainly rustic," she said, her smile never wavering. Gerald nodded, already walking to the railing to peer out at the water. "Peaceful, quiet. Must get lonely up here, Frank." He turned back to me, hands clasped behind his back. "Especially for a man your age." Something cold crawled up my spine. Gerald had never called me Frank before. At the wedding, it had been Mr. Dalton, formal and distant. The false familiarity felt rehearsed. "I managed just fine," I said. David moved to the wicker chair, Caroline's chair, and sat down without asking. The casual presumption of it hit me like a slap. Madison took the wooden rocker I'd built for our first anniversary, settling in as if she belonged there. "Dad," David began, his tone shifting to something that sounded like patience stretched thin. "We've been talking about your situation here, about what's best for everyone." The word situation landed wrong, like a door slamming when you expected it to open gently. "What situation is that?" Madison leaned forward, her expression soft with manufactured concern. "David's told us how you've been since Caroline passed. The isolation, the difficulties with maintenance on a property this size." She gestured vaguely at the house behind me, as if it were already condemned. Patricia nodded sympathetically. "It's a lot for one person, especially someone of your age. And with David living so far away if something happened." "What's something?" I asked. Gerald stepped back from the railing, his hands still clasped. "Health scares, falls, the kinds of things that happen to men in their 70s. Out here, who would know? Who would help?" The choreography was becoming clear. They'd planned this conversation, assigned roles, prepared talking points. David, the concerned son, Madison, the caring daughter-in-law, Gerald and Patricia, the practical voices of reason. "I'm 72, I said, "not an invalid." "Of course not," David said quickly. "But, Dad, be honest. When's the last time you had people over? When's the last time you used more than 2 rooms in this house?" I thought of the guest bedroom, with its untouched quilts, the dining room that hadn't seen a full table since Caroline's last birthday, the silence that filled the rooms like water in a sinking ship. "I use what I need," I said. Patricia smiled again, the expression empty of warmth. "That's exactly our point, Frank. All this space, all this upkeep, for one person. It seems almost wasteful." The word hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire, acrid and choking. Madison shifted forward in the rocker, the wood creaking under her weight. "Frank, we have a proposition. Something that could benefit everyone." I waited. The oak leaves rustled overhead, and somewhere across the lake, a loon called, its voice wild and free. "My parents need a place," Madison continued. "Their lease is up next month, and with the housing market the way it is..." She spread her hands in a gesture of helplessness. "They need somewhere stable, somewhere they can settle long-term." Gerald nodded gravely. "We're not asking for charity. We'd contribute to utilities, help with maintenance. I'm handy with tools. Patricia's an excellent housekeeper." "And you," Patricia added, her voice warm as honey over broken glass, "would have company. People around in case of emergencies. Family." The silence stretched. A hawk circled high above the lake, riding thermals with wings spread wide. Caroline had loved watching the hawks, said they reminded her that some things were meant to soar free. "Where exactly would I fit in this arrangement?" I asked. David's smile faltered slightly. "Well, the house has plenty of rooms. The master bedroom, obviously, would stay yours. But maybe it's time to consider something smaller, more manageable. There's that nice senior community in town." "You want me to move out of my own house?" "Not permanently," Madison said quickly. "Just downsizing. Think of it as transitioning to the next phase of life. My parents would take care of the day-to-day concerns, and you'd be free to focus on your health, your hobbies." Gerald stepped closer, his voice dropping to the tone men use when they think they're being reasonable. "Frank, we're all family here. This isn't about ownership or control. It's about what makes sense for everyone involved." I looked at David, sitting in his mother's chair as if he'd inherited it. His suit was pressed, his hair perfectly styled, his hands soft from office work. The boy who'd helped me rebuild the dock after the storm of '98 was gone, replaced by this stranger who spoke in corporate buzzwords and measured life in square footage. "And if I say no?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through their carefully planned presentation. David's jaw tightened. Madison's smile became more brittle. Gerald's eyes hardened. "Dad," David said, his voice carrying a warning, "don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help you. We're trying to do the right thing for everyone." Patricia stepped forward, her pearls catching the morning light. "Frank, dear, at your age, stubbornness isn't wisdom. It's just stubbornness. And stubbornness can be dangerous when you're living alone." The threat was delivered with a grandmother's smile, but it was a threat nonetheless. I felt something shift inside me, like tumblers falling into place in an old lock. "I see," I said quietly. The 4 of them watched me with the patience of vultures, waiting for capitulation, for the old man to understand his place in their plans. Madison reached out and patted my arm with false warmth. "I knew you'd understand, Frank. You've always been so practical." I stood slowly, my joints protesting the morning chill. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I drank it anyway, tasting the bitterness and finding it appropriate. "I need to think about this," I said. David's smile returned, wider now, confident. "Of course. Take all the time you need. But, Dad, don't take too long. My in-laws' lease is up November 1st, and finding alternatives..." He shrugged as if alternatives were impossible. 2 weeks. They were giving me 2 weeks to surrender my home, my memories, my connection to Caroline. 2 weeks to accept that I was now a burden to be managed rather than a father to be respected. "November 1st, I repeated. "November 1st, Gerald confirmed, extending his hand for another crushing handshake. "I think this is going to work out perfectly for everyone." They filed off the porch like generals who just conquered territory without firing a shot. David paused at the top of the steps, looking back at me with something that might have been affection or might have been pity. "We love you, Dad. We're just trying to take care of you." I watched them drive away, the black SUV disappearing around the bend where Caroline and I had planted dogwoods the first spring we lived here. The silence that followed felt different from my usual solitude. It felt like the quiet before a storm. I walked back into the house, through rooms that suddenly felt less like home and more like a museum of my former life. In the kitchen, the clock ticked with mechanical persistence. On the refrigerator, a faded photo showed David at age 8, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up the base he'd caught off our dock. His eyes had been bright with hero worship then, looking at me like I could solve any problem, fix anything broken. Now he looked at me like I was the problem that needed fixing. I sat at the kitchen table where Caroline and I had shared 32 years of morning coffee, afternoon snacks, and late-night conversations about everything and nothing. The wood bore the rings of countless mugs, small scars that told the story of a marriage. Her chair across from me looked expectant, as if she might walk in any moment with her hair pinned up and flour on her apron. But Caroline was gone, and I was alone with the echo of words that still rang in my ears. Wasteful, stubborn, dangerous. They'd measured my life in unused square footage and found it wanting. I reached for the yellow legal pad Caroline had used for grocery lists and began to write. At the top of the page, I printed one word in capital letters: options. Underneath, I started a list. 1. Accept their proposal. Become a guest in my own home. 2. Move to senior living. Lose everything Caroline and I built. 3. Refuse and face constant pressure. 4. Fight back. I stared at the fourth option for a long time. Fight back. What did that even mean for a 72-year-old widower whose son had just orchestrated the politest home invasion in history? The afternoon light shifted, painting golden rectangles on the kitchen floor. Somewhere in the distance, a chainsaw buzzed, probably old Pete clearing deadfall from his property line. The sound was methodical, purposeful, a man solving problems with the right tools. I thought about tools, about the difference between being used and being useful, about the lessons I'd learned in 40 years of construction work. Measure twice, cut once. Know your materials, build to last. And when something's rotten, you don't paint over it. You tear it out and start fresh. Caroline's voice seemed to whisper from the empty chair. Frank Dalton, I didn't raise you to go gentle into anybody's good night. She hadn't, at that. Caroline Brennan had married a man who built houses from the ground up, who'd turned a small construction crew into the most respected building company in 3 counties. She'd supported me through the lean years, celebrated with me through the good ones, and when cancer tried to take her, she'd fought it with the same determination she brought to everything else. She'd taught David to fight too, back when he was worth teaching. I stood up, walked to the living room, and pulled down the family albums from the bookshelf. Page after page of David growing up. First steps, first day of school, high school graduation, college, the wedding. Caroline appeared in most of them, her smile genuine, her arm around whichever milestone we were celebrating. But in the later photos, something had changed. David's smile became more practiced, his posture stiffer. The easy affection of childhood had been replaced by the careful distance of adulthood. When had I stopped being his father and become his disappointment? When had he stopped seeing me as a man and started seeing me as an obstacle? The phone rang, jarring me from the photographs. For a moment, I hoped it might be David calling to apologize, to say they'd reconsidered, that he'd remembered who raised him and how. It wasn't David. "Mr. Dalton, this is Patricia Monroe." Her voice was sickeningly sweet. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation today. Gerald and I are so excited about the possibility of calling your beautiful home our own. We'd love to start making plans." I held the receiver carefully, as if it might explode. Plans? Well, decorating ideas, furniture arrangements. I was thinking the living room could use updating, maybe something more contemporary. And that kitchen, bless its heart, it's so dated. Dated. The kitchen where Caroline had baked birthday cakes and Christmas cookies, where we'd shared Sunday breakfast for 3 decades, where she'd sat during her final months, too weak to stand, but too stubborn to stay in bed. "Mrs. Monroe," I said, my voice steady despite the fury building in my chest. "I haven't agreed to anything yet." "Oh, of course not. But David explained that it's really just a formality. You're such a sensible man. I'm sure you can see how perfect this arrangement will be for everyone involved." Perfect. The word sat in my mouth like sawdust. "I'll be in touch," I said, and hung up before she could respond. I sat in Caroline's chair and stared out at the lake. The water was dark now, reflecting the early stars. A family of geese paddled near the shoreline, their wake spreading in gentle V's behind them. Caroline had loved the geese, even when they left droppings on the dock. "They're just living their lives," she'd say. "Can't fault them for that." But what about when someone else decides where you get to live your life? I thought about David sitting in Caroline's wicker chair, claiming it with the casual arrogance of inheritance. I thought about Patricia criticizing my dated kitchen, already planning to erase Caroline's presence from the rooms where her spirit still lingered. They'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed I was weak. They were about to learn otherwise. I walked to the garage where Caroline's car sat under a tarp next to my work truck. The space smelled of motor oil and sawdust, familiar scents that grounded me. My toolbox sat on the bench, organized the way Caroline had taught me, everything in its place, ready when needed. I'd built this house with these tools. Every joint had been measured, every board had been cut to fit. Caroline had been my assistant on the project, handing me nails and holding boards steady while I worked. We'd dreamed it, planned it, and built it together. Now, David wanted to hand it over to strangers like it was just another piece of property to be managed and improved. He'd forgotten something important. You don't tear down what you didn't build, and you sure as hell don't underestimate the man who taught you how to swing a hammer. I opened my toolbox and found what I was looking for. My old carpenter's pencil, worn smooth from years of use. I carried it back to the kitchen and added one more item to my list of options. 5. Remind them who built this house, and who can tear it down. Outside, the lake lapped against the shoreline with the rhythm of a heartbeat, Caroline's heartbeat, steady and sure, reminding me that some things are worth fighting for. November 1st was 2 weeks away. Time to get to work. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold and the legal pad filling up with words that looked like battle plans. Outside, the lake was black as tar, broken only by the occasional ripple when a fish broke the surface or a beaver cut a wake toward shore. The house creaked around me with the familiar sounds of settling wood. The same groans and sighs I'd been listening to for 32 years, but tonight they sounded different, like the house was talking to me, reminding me of its bones, its foundation, its secrets. I'd built every inch of this place with my own hands. I knew where every wire ran, where every pipe curved through the walls, which floorboards squeaked and which joints would need attention in another decade. David had grown up here, but he had never learned these intimate details. To him, it was just the place where he had lived until college, generic as any other house. To me, it was Caroline made manifest in wood and stone. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on the pretense of trying to sleep and made another pot of coffee. The act of measuring grounds and pouring water was meditative, routine. Caroline had always been the early riser between us, up before dawn to tend her garden or read in the quiet hours before the world woke up. I'd gotten used to finding her in the kitchen, already dressed, coffee made, planning her day with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. Now, I was the one keeping vigil in the pre-dawn darkness. I pulled down the box of photo albums again and spread them across the table. 32 years of marriage, reduced to bound collections of glossy rectangles. But each image told a story, and tonight I needed to remember those stories clearly. Here was David at 6, helping me frame the garage. He wore a hard hat that was too big for him, and carried a toy hammer in his belt loop, mimicking every move I made. In the photo, he was looking up at me with absolute trust, as if I were the source of all knowledges and strength in his small world. Here he was at 12, sulking because I'd made him restack a cord of firewood when he'd done it carelessly the first time. "But it's good enough," he had protested. "Good enough isn't good enough," I'd replied, a lesson I had learned from my own father. If you're going to do something, do it right. And here at 16, standing proudly next to the dock, we'd rebuilt together after the ice storm of '01. 3 weeks of work, every board measured and fitted precisely. David had complained about the time it took, wanted to hire someone to do it faster, but when we finished, When he saw how solid and true it was, he'd understood. "It'll last forever," he'd said. "That's the point," I'd told him. The photos continued chronologically through the years: high school graduation, college, his first job, meeting Madison. I could track the changes in his face, the gradual shift from the earnest boy who'd helped me build this place to the polished young man who saw everything in terms of efficiency and bottom lines. Madison appeared in the photos around year 26 of our albums. She was beautiful, I'd give her that, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of money and leisure. But even in those early pictures, there was something calculating in her eyes, a quality that made me think of a buyer evaluating merchandise. The wedding photos came next. Caroline in her blue dress, tears of joy on her cheeks as she watched David promise to love and honor the woman beside him. I'd given a toast that night about how marriage was like building a house. It required a solid foundation, careful attention to detail, and constant maintenance to keep it strong. David had laughed at the construction metaphor. Madison had smiled politely, but it was the later photos that hurt to look at. Christmas gatherings where David seemed distracted, checking his phone during dinner, Easter Sunday when Madison had criticized Caroline's ham, suggesting next time they should cater. The last family photo we'd taken, just 6 months before Caroline's diagnosis, where David stood slightly apart from the rest of us, as if he were already planning his escape. When had I lost him? When had his mother's son become his wife's husband, more loyal to Patricia's opinions than to the values Caroline and I had tried to instill? The answer came to me as dawn started to lighten the eastern sky. I'd lost him when I stopped being useful to him. For years, I'd been the man with answers, the one who could fix anything, build anything, solve any problem. David had needed those skills when he was young, learning how the world worked. But somewhere along the way, he'd decided my knowledge was obsolete, my experience irrelevant to his modern problems. He'd forgotten that the man who taught him how to swing a hammer had also taught him how to stand up straight, how to keep his word, how to treat people with respect, regardless of their bank account or social status. He'd kept the first lesson and discarded the rest. The phone rang at 8:30, jolting me from my memories. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Dad, good morning." His voice was crisp, businesslike. "I wanted to follow up on yesterday's conversation. Have you had time to think about our proposal?" Our proposal, as if it had been a collaborative effort rather than an ambush. "I've been thinking," I said. "And?" I could hear the expectation in his voice, the assumption that I'd already capitulated, that the old man would see reason and accept his diminished role gracefully. "I have some questions," I said. A pause. Then, "Of course, what questions? Where exactly would I sleep in this arrangement? You mentioned the master bedroom would stay mine, but Patricia's already talking about redecorating. Hard to redecorate around someone who's still living there." Another pause, longer this time. "Well, Dad, we thought, there's that nice little room off the kitchen. It used to be Caroline's sewing room. It would be perfect for you. Quiet, private, close to the bathroom. Caroline's sewing room. The space where she'd created quilts for our bed, costumes for David's school plays, curtains for every window in the house. 8 feet by 10 feet, barely large enough for a single bed and dresser." "I see," I said. "And my workshop in the garage?" "Gerald's excited to use that space. He's got quite a few projects lined up. But don't worry, there's storage in the basement for your tools." Storage. My lifetime collection of hand tools, many of them inherited from my father, reduced to clutter that needed to be stored out of sight. "What about Caroline's garden?" "Madison's mother has some wonderful ideas for landscaping. Patricia thinks the vegetable garden is inefficient. She'd prefer ornamental plants, maybe a fountain. Caroline's garden, where she'd grown tomatoes and peppers and herbs, where she'd spent every morning from April through October, where her ashes were scattered among the rose bushes she'd tended for 3 decades. Patricia wanted to dig it up and install a fountain." "Dad, you still there?" "I'm here," I said. "So what do you think? It really is the perfect solution for everyone involved. Perfect for everyone except the man who'd built the house, married the woman, planted the garden, and created every memory that made this place sacred." "I need more time," I said. David's tone shifted, became more impatient. "Dad, I told you, Gerald and Patricia's lease is up November 1st. We need to know so they can make arrangements. You'll know when I decide. Dad? I hung up. The silence that followed felt like the moment after a tree falls in the forest, when all the birds have stopped singing and the world is holding its breath. I walked through the house slowly, seeing it through their eyes. Patricia would tear out the kitchen cabinets Caroline had picked out, refinish the hardwood floors we'd installed board by board, replace the windows I'd framed with my own hands. Gerald would convert my workshop into his hobby space, hang his tools where mine had lived for decades, fill the air with the scent of his projects instead of mine. David would let them do it all, because to him, this was just property, square footage, an asset to be managed rather than a home to be preserved. But he'd made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd forgotten that I still owned this place. My name was on the deed, my signature on the mortgage that had been paid off 15 years ago. Whatever authority he thought he had came from assumption, not law. I went to the bedroom and pulled out the fireproof safe where Caroline and I kept our important documents. Inside were the papers that told the story of our financial life: birth certificates, marriage license, insurance policies, and there at the bottom, the deed to this property. 43 acres of lakefront land, purchased in '92, owned outright by Frank and Caroline Dalton. Caroline's name had been removed after her death, leaving just mine. Just mine. David could propose, and Patricia could redecorate, and Gerald could commandeer my workshop. But at the end of the day, this was still my house. They had no legal claim, no authority beyond what I chose to give them, and I was choosing to give them nothing. The realization hit me like cool water on a hot day, refreshing and clarifying. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't a burden to be managed or an obstacle to be removed. I was a 72-year-old man who owned valuable property and had 40 years of construction experience and enough steel in his spine to remind his son who raised him. But I needed help. I needed someone who understood the law, who could advise me on my options, who could help me protect what Caroline and I had built together. I needed Marcus Henderson. Marcus had been my lawyer for 25 years, handling everything from contract disputes to will preparation. He was my age, maybe a year or two younger, with the kind of sharp mind that came from decades of untangling other people's problems. More importantly, he'd known Caroline. He'd understand what this place meant, why it couldn't be handed over to strangers like a piece of rental property. I called his office at 9 sharp, when I knew he'd be at his desk with his first cup of coffee, reviewing the day's schedule. "Marcus, it's Frank Dalton." "Frank, good to hear from you. How are you managing?" "I need to see you," I said. "Today, if possible. It's about the house." "What about the house?" "Someone wants to take it from me." There was a pause, then, "Come in at 11, I'll clear my schedule." Marcus's office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian on Main Street, the kind of solid, unpretentious space that inspired confidence. The walls were lined with law books and photographs of local landmarks, and his desk was made from reclaimed barnwood that I'd helped install 15 years earlier when he'd renovated the building. "Tell me what's happening," he said after I'd settled into the leather chair across from his desk. I told him everything: David's surprise visit, the 4-person intervention, the casual way they'd discussed my future as if I weren't sitting right there. I showed him Patricia's phone call, Gerald's presumptions about my workshop, David's assumption that I'd accept exile to Caroline's sewing room. Marcus listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "They can't force you to sell," he said. "The property is yours, free and clear. But Frank, they can make your life very difficult if they're determined." "How?" "Constant pressure, financial manipulation if they can find leverage. In extreme cases, adult children have been known to pursue guardianship proceedings, claiming their parent is no longer competent to make decisions." The words hit me like a physical blow. They'd try to have me declared incompetent? I'm not saying they will. I'm saying it's a tool some people use when other methods fail. The burden of proof is high, and it's hard to make stick, especially when the alleged incompetent person has good legal representation. He smiled slightly. "Which you do. What are my options?" Marcus opened a file drawer and pulled out several blank forms. "First, we make sure your documentation is bulletproof. Updated will, power of attorney designations, advanced directives. If someone challenges your competency, we want clear evidence that you've been thinking rationally about your future." We spent the next hour reviewing paperwork, updating beneficiaries, clarifying my wishes for medical care and property distribution. It felt morbid, planning for my own decline, but also strangely liberating. These were my choices, my decisions about my own life. There's something else, Spiritus, Marcus said as we finished. Have you considered making it harder for them to challenge your ownership? How? A trust. You transfer the property to a revocable living trust with yourself as trustee. For all practical purposes, nothing changes. You control everything during your lifetime, but it makes the property much more difficult to attack legally. And if I want to sell, as trustee, you can do whatever you want. Think of it as insurance. I signed the preliminary paperwork, authorizing Marcus to draft the trust documents. As I wrote my name, I thought about David's confidence yesterday, his assumption that I'd roll over and accept whatever arrangement he'd concocted. He was about to learn that 72 years of life had taught me a few things about fighting back. How long will this take? I asked. I can have the trust ready by the end of the week. But, Frank, there's something else you should consider. What's that? Marcus leaned forward. They're coming at you because they think you're isolated and vulnerable, but you're not. You have friends, resources, legal protections. Don't let them convince you otherwise. I drove home with Marcus's words echoing in my mind. I wasn't isolated. I had Tom Bailey, my neighbor across the lake, who'd helped me stack firewood every fall for 15 years. I had Pete Kowalski down the road, who shared tools and coffee and complained about the weather with the dedication of a true craftsman. I had the guys from the volunteer fire department, where I had served for 20 years before retiring. I had a community that David had forgotten about, people who knew me as Frank Dalton the man, not Frank Dalton the burden. But most importantly, I had something they didn't. The knowledge that comes from building something with your own hands. David and his wife and her parents could scheme and manipulate and pressure all they wanted. They'd still have to reckon with the man who knew every secret this house contained, and I was just getting started. Part 3. Blueprints. The next 3 days passed in a strange rhythm. David called twice more, his tone growing increasingly sharp as I continued to deflect his questions about my decision. Madison left a voicemail about exciting decorating plans, as if my surrender were already a foregone conclusion. Patricia sent a handwritten note, actually handwritten, as if the personal touch might soften me, outlining her vision for improving the property. I read every word, filed every message, and said nothing. Meanwhile, I began my own preparations. Thursday morning, I drove to Henderson Electronics, a cluttered shop downtown where Tommy Henderson, Marcus's nephew, sold and serviced security systems for local businesses. Tommy was in his 40s, built like a linebacker gone soft, with grease under his fingernails and the kind of practical intelligence that comes from fixing things that actually matter. "Mr. Dalton," he said, looking up from a control panel he'd been working on. "Haven't seen you in a while. How you been managing since Mrs. Dalton passed?" "Getting by," I said. "Tommy, I need to ask you about home security systems." His eyebrows went up. "Security? Out at the lake? Frank, you've got 40 acres and the nearest neighbor's a quarter-mile away. What are you worried about?" "People who think they can help themselves to what's mine." Tommy set down his screwdriver and gave me his full attention. "What kind of people?" I told him what I needed to tell him, that I was having family troubles, that some folks were getting ideas about my property that didn't align with my own plans. I didn't go into specifics, but Tommy was sharp enough to read between the lines. "So, you want to know who's coming and going," he said. "I want to know everything that happens on my property when I'm not there to see it myself." Tommy walked me through the options. Cameras that could record to a hidden server, motion sensors that would alert my phone, smart locks that could be controlled remotely. The technology had come a long way since Caroline and I had installed our basic alarm system 20 years ago. "The thing about modern systems," Tommy explained, "is they're not just about keeping people out anymore. They're about information. Knowledge is power and all that." Knowledge is power. I liked the sound of that. "How quickly could you install something?" I asked. "Depends on how elaborate you want to get. Basic setup. I could have it done by Saturday. Full surveillance network with remote monitoring. That's more like a week. Start with basic," I said. "We can always expand later." Tommy nodded. "I'll come out tomorrow morning to do a site survey. Have equipment delivered by end of day. Cash or check?" "Cash," I said. "And Tommy, I'd appreciate if you kept this between us for now." Family troubles usually are private, he agreed. Don't worry, Mr. Dalton. Your business stays your business. That afternoon, I made another call, this one to Jim Kowalski, Pete's brother, who ran a small landscaping company out of Millerville. Jim had worked on several of my construction projects over the years, handling the finish grading and plantings that turned building sites into homes. More importantly, he was discreet, reliable, and owed me a favor from when I had helped him through a nasty divorce 5 years back. Frank, good to hear from you. What can I do for you? Jim, I need some work done at the lakehouse. Subtle work, the kind that improves things without being obvious about it. What kind of improvements? I'd been thinking about this since my conversation with Marcus. If David and his in-laws were planning to take over my property, they'd need to feel comfortable there, secure in their assumption that I was beaten. But comfort and security were things that could be adjusted. Privacy screening, I said. Natural barriers, the kind that make a place feel more isolated than it actually is. Jim was quiet for a moment. You having neighbor troubles, Frank? Something like that. I can work with that. When do you want me to start? Soon as possible, but Jim, this needs to stay between us for now. Understood. I'll come out Sunday to take a look, give you some ideas. By Friday evening, I had the skeleton of a plan. Nothing illegal, nothing that would hurt anyone, just a series of modifications that would make my property less appealing to unwanted house guests. Tommy had installed the basic security system. Cameras hidden in the eaves, motion sensors disguised as landscape lights, smart locks on all the doors that I could control from my phone. Systems active, Tommy said as he packed up his tools. Any motion near the house gets recorded, and you'll get an alert on your phone. You can watch the feeds from anywhere with internet service. I tested it by walking around the house while watching my phone. The cameras tracked my movement with silent precision, recording everything to a server hidden in the basement utility room. For the first time since David's ambush, I felt like I had some measure of control back. Saturday morning brought Jim Kowalski and a truck full of equipment. We walked the property together, and I explained what I wanted. Natural barriers that would funnel visitors along specific routes, landscaping that would create blind spots and screening, subtle changes that would make the house feel more isolated and defensible. You want to turn your home into a fortress, Jim said. I want to make sure people understand they're guests here, not owners. Jim nodded slowly. I can do that. Fast-growing privacy hedges along the road, maybe some strategic tree plantings, dense enough to cut sight lines, thick enough to discourage casual wandering. Make the whole place feel more private. How long? 2 weeks for the major plantings. But Frank, if you're really worried about security, there are other things we could do. Lighting systems, maybe some natural barriers that would encourage people to stick to the main driveway. Such as? Jim's grin was conspiratorial. Ever hear of blackberry brambles? Fast-growing, thorny as hell, and perfectly natural. Plant them in the right spots, and people learn real quick to stay on the path you want them on. By Sunday evening, my property was beginning its transformation. The security system watched silently from hidden perches, recording every vehicle that passed, every person who approached the house. Jim's crew had started planting the privacy barriers, working with the focused efficiency of men who understood that some jobs were better done quickly and quietly. But the most important piece of my plan was taking shape in Marcus Henderson's office, where the trust documents were being finalized with the kind of legal precision that would make them bulletproof. Monday morning, David called again. Dad, we need to talk. Gerald and Patricia are getting nervous about their housing situation. Their lease expires at the end of the next week, and they need to know if they can count on the lakehouse. His tone had shifted from patient to demanding, the way it used to when he was a teenager who'd been told no and couldn't believe it. They can't count on the lakehouse, I said. Silence. Then, what do you mean? I mean the house isn't available. Dad, be reasonable. We've been over this. You can't maintain that place by yourself, and it's too big for one person anyway. Gerald and Patricia need somewhere to live, and this arrangement benefits everyone. Everyone except me. That's not true. You'd have company, people to help with maintenance, family around in case of emergency. David, I interrupted, do you remember when you were 16 and you wanted to quit the baseball team because practice was cutting into your social time? What does that have to do with anything? Do you remember what I told you? A pause. Not really. I remembered perfectly. We'd been in the garage working on his car when he'd announced his plan to quit mid-season. Caroline had wanted to let him make his own choice, but I'd known better. I told you that commitment means something, I said now. That when you give your word, you keep it, even when it becomes inconvenient. That a man who won't finish what he starts isn't much of a man at all. I finished the season, David said quietly. Yes, you did. And you learned something about yourself that summer, about what you were capable of when you didn't quit just because things got difficult. Dad, what's your point? My point is that I made a commitment to your mother. I promised her I'd keep this house exactly as she left it, that I'd preserve what we built together. You're asking me to break that promise because it would be convenient for your in-laws. Mom's gone, Dad. She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. The words hit harder than a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. Maybe not, I said finally, but keeping my word to her is going to keep me who I am. And who I am is not a man who gets pushed around by his own son. Another silence. When David spoke again, his voice was cold. So, that's your answer? You're going to let Gerald and Patricia become homeless because you're clinging to a house full of ghosts? Gerald and Patricia aren't my responsibility. They're yours. You figure out how to house them without stealing from me. I'm not stealing anything. I'm trying to help. No, I said. You're trying to manage me. There's a difference. I hung up before he could respond. The silence that followed that felt different this time, not empty, but charged with possibility. For 3 years, I'd been drifting through days that felt provisional, as if the real business of living were something that happened to other people. But now I felt awake again, purposeful, like a man with work to do. Tuesday afternoon, Marcus called with news. Trust documents are ready, he said. I can meet you tomorrow to sign, or if you prefer, I can drive out to you. I'll come to you, I said. And Marcus, is there a way to make this transfer happen quickly? Like, same day? If you want to expedite the recording, yes. I have contacts at the county clerk's office. For the right fee, they'll process it immediately. Do it. Wednesday morning, I sat in Marcus's office and signed my name to documents that would change everything. The Frank and Caroline Dalton Revocable Living Trust was now the legal owner of my property, with me as sole trustee and beneficiary. On paper, it looked like a simple estate planning move. In reality, it was armor against anyone who thought that they could pressure me into giving up what was mine. How does it feel? Marcus asked as we finished. Like I just took out an insurance policy against my own son, I said. Frank, I hope it doesn't come to that. So do I, but if it does, I'm ready. That evening, as the sun set over the lake, I walked the perimeter of my property. Jim's crew had made remarkable progress in just 3 days. The privacy hedges were already taking root, and the blackberry brambles were establishing themselves along the property line with the aggressive enthusiasm of truly invasive species. In a few months, anyone who wandered off the designated path would find themselves entangled in thorns. The house itself looked unchanged to casual observation, but I knew better. Cameras watched from hidden vantage points. Sensors monitored every approach, and locks that had once relied on simple keys now answered to electronic commands that only I controlled. Most importantly, the legal foundation beneath everything had shifted in ways that David and his co-conspirators couldn't see but would soon feel. I thought about Caroline, about the promise I'd made at her bedside. She'd worried that David would pressure me to sell after she was gone, that I'd give in to avoid conflict and end up somewhere that held no memories of our life together. Don't let them erase us, Frank, she'd whispered during one of our last conversations. This place is our story. Don't let anyone rewrite it. I wouldn't. Whatever David had planned, whatever pressure Gerald and Patricia thought that they could bring to bear, whatever legal or emotional manipulation they intended to use, they were about to discover that the quiet old man they had ambushed on his own porch was not as helpless as they'd assumed. The fight was coming. I could feel it in the way David's voice had turned cold, in Patricia's increasingly presumptuous phone calls, in the deadline they'd imposed as if they had the authority to set terms for my own life. But I was ready for them now, more than ready. I was armed with 40 years of construction knowledge, 32 years of marriage wisdom, and 3 years of grief that had finally crystallized into something harder than sorrow, stronger than rage. They wanted my house. They were welcome to try taking it, but they'd better bring their own tools because I wasn't handing over mine. November 1st arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that Caroline had always loved. The maples along the shoreline blazed red and gold, and the lake reflected the sky like polished metal. I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the mist rise from the water, and waited. They came at 10:30, exactly on schedule. The same black SUV, the same 4 passengers, but this time their body language was different, more confident, more proprietary. David walked up the porch steps like a man returning to his own property. Gerald carried a leather briefcase as if he were here on business, and Patricia had a measuring tape clipped to her belt. Madison hung back slightly. And I caught something in her expression that might have been doubt, or maybe just discomfort at what they were about to do. "Dad," David said, his smile bright and false. "Ready for the big day?" I stayed in my chair, hands wrapped around my coffee mug. "What big day is that?" Gerald stepped forward, briefcase in hand. "Moving day, Frank. We've got the rental truck coming this afternoon to start bringing our things over." "Whose things?" I asked. Patricia laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Our things, silly. We're moving in today, remember? You agreed to let us stay here while you transition to more suitable accommodations." "I don't recall agreeing to anything," I said. The 4 of them exchanged glances. David's smile became more strained. "Dad, we've been over this. Gerald and Patricia's lease expired yesterday. They need somewhere to live, and this house is too big for you anyway. It's the practical solution." "Practical for who?" Gerald opened his briefcase and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "Frank, I took the liberty of researching some senior living communities in the area. Beautiful places, really. Full service, medical care on site, activities coordinators. You'd love it." He held out a brochure featuring smiling elderly people playing cards and doing watercolor paintings. The kind of glossy marketing material that made warehousing the old look like a vacation resort. "And I suppose you've already picked one out for me," I said. "Well, there's a lovely place called Sunset Manor about 20 minutes from here," Patricia said. "They have an opening next week, and Gerald's already put down a deposit." Gerald's already put down a deposit. Using whose money, I wondered. Madison finally spoke up. "Frank, we know this is a big adjustment, but we'll take excellent care of the house. My mother has wonderful ideas for updating things, and Gerald's very handy with repairs." "Updates," I repeated. "What kind of updates?" Patricia's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been planning this for weeks. "Oh, so many things. The kitchen is terribly dated. We'll want to tear out those old cabinets and put in something more contemporary. And the living room needs completely new furniture. That old stuff is so heavy and dark." The old stuff. The furniture Caroline and I had chosen together, piece by piece, over 3 decades of marriage. The dining set we'd bought for our 5th anniversary, the china cabinet where she'd displayed her grandmother's dishes, the rocking chair where she'd nursed David as a baby. "And the garden," Gerald added. "That vegetable plot is taking up prime real estate. Patricia's thinking of a nice fountain, maybe some ornamental shrubs." Caroline's garden, where she'd grown tomatoes and peppers and the herbs that had seasoned 32 years of home-cooked meals, where her ashes were scattered among the roses she'd tended like beloved children. They wanted to dig it up and install a fountain. I set my coffee mug on the table beside my chair and stood slowly. My joints protested the movement, reminding me of my 72 years, but my spine felt straighter than it had in months. "That's interesting," I said. "Just one problem with your plans." David's smile faltered slightly. "What problem?" I walked to the front door and retrieved the manila envelope I'd left on the hall table. Inside were the documents Marcus had prepared, along with copies of everything else they'd need to understand their situation. "This problem," I said, handing David the first document. He unfolded it, scanning the legal language with growing confusion. Gerald moved to read over his shoulder, his brow furrowing as he processed what he was seeing. "What is this?" David asked. "That's the deed transfer for this property. As of yesterday, the house and all 43 acres are owned by the Frank and Caroline Dalton Revocable Living Trust. I'm the sole trustee." "So?" Patricia said. "It's still your house?" I handed her another document. "This is the property management agreement I signed with Kowalski Brothers Landscaping. They're now responsible for maintaining the grounds and controlling access to the property." Gerald's face was beginning to redden. "Frank, what are you trying to pull here?" "And this," I said, giving Madison the final document, "is the no trespass order I filed with the county sheriff yesterday. Anyone who enters this property without my written permission is subject to immediate arrest. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the lake lapping against the shoreline 100 yards away. David looked up from the papers, his eyes hard. "Dad, this is ridiculous. You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want," I said quietly. "It's my property." "But we made plans," Patricia sputtered. "We gave up our apartment. We have nowhere else to go." "That sounds like your problem, not mine." Gerald stepped forward, his face now fully flushed. "Now you listen here, old man. We had an agreement." "We had a conversation," I corrected, "during which you told me what you intended to do with my house, my furniture, my wife's garden, and my life. At no point did I agree to any of it." Madison looked stricken. "Frank, be reasonable. We can work something out. We can work out you leaving my property immediately." David crumpled the papers in his fist. "This is insane. You're being paranoid and stubborn and—" "Careful," I said, my voice dropping to the tone I'd used when he was a child and testing boundaries. "You're still on my porch, talking about my decisions regarding my property. I'd suggest you remember that." For a moment, David looked like the boy who'd once climbed into my lap during thunderstorms, uncertain and small. But then his expression hardened into something I didn't recognize. "Fine," he said. "You want to play games? We'll play games. But don't come crying to me when you can't manage this place anymore, when you fall down those stairs or have another hard episode and there's no one around to help." "I won't," I said. They filed off the porch like a defeated army, Gerald muttering curses under his breath, Patricia complaining loudly about how inconsiderate I was being. Madison kept glancing back as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. David paused at the bottom of the steps. "This isn't over, Dad." "Yes," I said, "it is." I watched them drive away, the black SUV disappearing around the bend where Caroline and I had planted dogwoods 20 years ago. The silence they left behind felt different from any quiet I'd experienced since Caroline's death. Not empty, but full of possibility. I pulled out my phone and called Tommy Henderson. "Tommy, it's Frank Dalton. I need you to change all the access codes on the security system, and I want the camera switched to active monitoring." "Everything okay out there, Mr. Dalton?" "Everything's fine, but I want to make sure it stays that way." Next I called Jim Kowalski. "Jim, they came and went. Time to implement the full landscaping plan." "You want me to finish the barriers?" "I want you to make this place impenetrable to anyone who doesn't belong here." My final call was to Marcus Henderson. "It's done," I told him. "They made their play and I shut them down." "How did they take it?" "About as well as you'd expect. Marcus, I want you to file an additional document with the county, a formal declaration that Gerald and Patricia Monroe are never to be granted access to this property under any circumstances." "That's pretty extreme, Frank." "So is trying to steal someone's house." That afternoon, I walked through my home with new eyes. Every room, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the walls, all of it still mine, still under my control, still holding the memories Caroline and I had created together. In the kitchen, I made myself lunch and ate it at the table where we'd shared 32 years of meals. In the living room, I sat in Caroline's chair and looked out at the lake where we'd watched seasons change and grandchildren that never came to visit. In the bedroom, I opened the drawer where I kept Caroline's jewelry and pulled out her wedding ring. The gold was worn smooth from decades of wear, but it still caught the light, like the day I'd slipped it onto her finger. "I kept my promise," I said to her photograph on the dresser. "I didn't let them erase us." As the sun set over the lake, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Caroline died. Complete peace. Not the brittle calm of resignation, but the deep satisfaction that comes from fighting for something that matters and winning. My phone buzzed with a text message. David's name appeared on the screen. "This was a mistake, Dad. You're going to regret this." I deleted the message without responding and turned off the phone. Outside, a family of geese paddled past the dock, their wake spreading in gentle V's behind them. The security cameras watched silently from their hidden perches. The motion sensor stood ready to alert me to any unwanted visitors, and the blackberry brambles that Jim's crew had planted were already beginning to thicken along the property line. I'd built this house with my own hands, filled it with love and laughter and 32 years of marriage. I'd buried my wife's ashes in the garden she'd tended, scattered her memory through every room like light through stained glass. And I'd be damned if I was going to let anyone take it away from me, even if that someone was my own son. David had forgotten the most important lesson I'd tried to teach him, that some things are worth fighting for, no matter what the cost. He'd just learned it the hard way. The war was over, and I'd won. Not through violence or anger, but through the careful application of legal knowledge, strategic thinking, and the kind of stubborn determination that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're willing to defend. I sat on the porch until the stars came out, listening to the lake lap against the shoreline and feeling more like myself than I had in 3 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts by David and his co-conspirators to pressure me or manipulate me or find some way around the barriers I'd erected. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in the house I'd built, on the land I'd earned, surrounded by the memories of the woman I'd loved. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The peace lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of quiet mornings with coffee on the porch, of reading Caroline's old gardening magazines, of small maintenance projects that reminded me why I'd loved working with my hands. The security cameras showed nothing more threatening than deer browsing near the driveway and the occasional delivery truck dropping off packages at the gate. I'd almost started to believe that David had accepted defeat when the calls began. The first one came from a number I didn't recognize. A woman's voice, professionally warm, but with an underlying edge of authority. "Mr. Dalton, this is Karen Morrison from Adult Protective Services. I've received a report of concern regarding your living situation. I wonder if I could schedule a time to visit with you?" My blood went cold. "What kind of report?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics over the phone, but there are concerns about your ability to maintain your current residence safely. Standard procedure is to conduct a welfare check to ensure you have adequate support systems in place." Adult Protective Services. David had escalated. "When would you like to visit?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "Would this Thursday at 2 o'clock work for you?" "Thursday's fine." After she hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. I'd expected another frontal assault, maybe legal pressure or financial manipulation, but this was more subtle, more dangerous. A report to APS could result in a competency evaluation, court-ordered supervision, even forced relocation if they determined I was unable to care for myself. It was exactly the kind of strategy I should have expected from someone with Gerald Monroe's business background. I called Marcus immediately. "They filed an APS report," I told him. "Someone's coming Thursday to evaluate my living situation." "On what grounds?" The woman wouldn't say specifics, but I can guess. Isolated elderly man, recent family conflict, concerns about safety and self-care. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Frank, APS takes these reports seriously, even when they're motivated by family disputes. You need to be prepared to demonstrate that you're competent, well cared for, and not in any danger." "What does that mean, practically?" "Clean house, organized paperwork, evidence of regular medical care, social connections. They'll be looking for signs of neglect, confusion, or isolation that might indicate you need supervised care. And if they decide I can't live independently, then we fight it in court. But Frank, prevention is better than treatment. Make sure they have no grounds for concern." Thursday morning, I spent 2 hours preparing for the visit. I cleaned the house from top to bottom, organized my medications with clear labels and instructions, laid out financial statements showing my accounts were current and properly managed. I even called Tom Bailey and asked him to stop by during the APS visit, just to demonstrate I had social connections in the community. Karen Morrison arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, driving a government sedan with official plates. She was younger than I had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of efficient manner that suggested she'd seen everything and was rarely surprised by anything. "Mr. Dalton, thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I know these visits can feel intrusive, but I hope you understand we're here to help." "I understand," I said, leading her into the living room. "Can you tell me more about the concerns that were reported?" She consulted her tablet. "The report alleged that you're living in isolation, that you may be experiencing cognitive decline, and that family members are concerned about your ability to maintain this property safely. There were also mentions of recent erratic behavior and possible paranoid tendencies." Erratic behavior, paranoid tendencies. David had painted me as a failing old man whose grip on reality was slipping. "I see," I said. "What would you like to know?" The interview lasted an hour. Morrison asked about my daily routine, my medical care, my social connections, my ability to manage household tasks and finances. She walked through the house, noting the cleanliness, the organization, the signs of active maintenance. Tom Bailey arrived halfway through, as planned, and chatted easily about our friendship, the projects we'd worked on together, the community connections we shared. His presence clearly impressed Morrison. Here was evidence that I wasn't the isolated hermit the report had suggested. "Mr. Dalton," Morrison said as she prepared to leave, "I have to tell you, I see no evidence of the concerns that were reported. Your home is well maintained, you appear to be in good health and sound mind, and you obviously have supportive relationships in the community. So, you'll close the case? I'll file a report stating that the allegations were unsubstantiated. But, Mr. Dalton, I should warn you, sometimes these family disputes escalate. If you continue to receive reports, they could eventually trigger a more formal evaluation process." After she left, I sat on the porch and tried to process what had just happened. David hadn't just tried to pressure me into giving up my home. He'd tried to have the state intervene on his behalf, using the legal system as a weapon against his own father. The boy I'd raised would never have done such a thing, but that boy was gone, replaced by this stranger who would apparently stop at nothing to get what he wanted. My phone rang. David's number. "Dad, I heard you had a visit from social services today." His tone was casual, almost conversational, but I could hear the smugness underneath. "You heard correctly," I said. "Everything go okay?" "Everything went fine. They found no evidence of the concerns that were reported." A pause. "That's good to hear, Dad. I was worried about you." "Were you, or were you hoping they'd find me incompetent so you could take over my affairs?" "Dad, that's a terrible thing to say. I'm just concerned about your well-being. David, let me be very clear about something. If you ever file another false report about me with any government agency, I will have you prosecuted for harassment. And if you think I won't follow through, you're welcome to test me." I hung up before he could respond. That evening, Marcus called with more disturbing news. "Frank, I've been doing some research into Gerald Monroe's background. Did you know he filed for bankruptcy 3 years ago?" "I didn't know that." "Lost his consulting business, defaulted on several loans. He and Patricia have been living in subsidized housing since then, surviving on her disability payments and whatever odd jobs he can pick up." The pieces clicked into place. Gerald and Patricia weren't just looking for a nicer place to live. They were desperate, financially ruined, grasping at any opportunity to improve their circumstances. My lake house wasn't just attractive to them, it was their salvation. "That explains the urgency," I said. "They're not just entitled, they're broke." It gets worse. I found records of 2 previous lawsuits Gerald filed against elderly relatives, claiming they were incompetent and needed financial guardians. Both cases were dismissed, but he's clearly done this before. My chest tightened. He's a predator. That's one word for it. The pattern suggests he targets vulnerable elderly family members, tries to gain control of their assets through legal manipulation. And David invited him into my life. David may not know the full extent of Gerald's history, but Frank, you need to be very careful. If Gerald's as desperate as his financial records suggest, he won't give up easily. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, checking locks, reviewing camera feeds, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The security system showed nothing unusual, but my nerves remained on edge. Around midnight, I found myself in Caroline's sewing room, surrounded by her unfinished projects. Half-completed quilts draped over chairs, patterns pinned to bulletin boards, spools of thread organized by color in the precise system she'd developed over years of creating beautiful things. This was the room David had suggested I move into, the 8x10 space that would have been my entire world if I'd accepted his plan. Looking at it now, I could see what my life would have become. An elderly man shuffled into a corner, surrounded by someone else's belongings, existing on their sufferance. The thought made me sick. I pulled out Caroline's unfinished quilt, a wedding ring pattern in shades of blue and gold that she'd been working on when she got too sick to continue. The pieces were precisely cut, pinned together with the meticulous care she brought to everything. All it needed was someone to sew the final seams. I'd never done quilting, but I understood patterns, measurements, the patience required to turn individual pieces into something whole. It seemed fitting that I should finish this last project, this final gift from the woman who'd shared 32 years of my life. As I worked, threading the needle the way Caroline had taught me years ago when she'd repaired my torn work shirts, I found myself thinking about David, not the manipulative stranger who'd tried to steal my home, but the boy who'd sat in this same room while his mother sewed, listening to her stories, absorbing her lessons about patience and precision and the satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful. When had he forgotten those lessons? When had he started seeing people as obstacles to be managed rather than relationships to be cherished? The answer didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he'd made his choice, and I'd made mine. By dawn, I'd finished the quilt. It wasn't perfect, my stitches were larger than Caroline's, my technique rougher, but it was complete, a thing of beauty created from separate pieces, held together by careful planning and stubborn determination, like the life Caroline and I had built together. Like the stand I was making now. I spread the finished quilt across our bed, where Caroline's presence still lingered in the pillow she'd slept on, the book she'd left on the nightstand, the reading glasses she'd worn to work on this very project. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her photograph on the dresser. "They can scheme and manipulate and file false reports all they want. This is our home, and I'm staying right here." Outside, the sun rose over the lake, painting the water gold, and promising another day of challenges and choices. But for the first time in weeks, I felt ready for whatever came next. Let David and Gerald plot their next move. Let them file more reports, bring more pressure, try more legal maneuvers. I'd weathered bigger storms than this. I'd built a business from nothing, raised a son through his troubled years, cared for a dying wife with grace and devotion. I could certainly handle a few desperate people who'd mistaken my kindness for weakness. The war wasn't over. But I was no longer fighting defensive battles. It was time to go on the offense. The inspiration came to me on a Tuesday morning while I was reading Caroline's journal. I'd found it tucked away in her desk drawer, a leather-bound book where she'd recorded her thoughts during those final months. Most entries were about the garden, lists of plants to divide, or notes about which roses needed pruning. But scattered throughout were observations about David, worries that had clearly weighed on her mind. Frank thinks I'm being too hard on David, but I see things he doesn't. The way Madison looks at our house like she's appraising it. The way David calculates everything in dollars now instead of in memories. I'm afraid of what will happen to Frank after I'm gone. He's too trusting, too willing to give David the benefit of the doubt. Caroline had seen it coming. She'd known what David would become, had worried about exactly the scenario that was now unfolding, but she'd also left me something else. A blueprint for fighting back. The house is more than property. It's our story made manifest. If someone tries to take it from Frank, he needs to remember that stories have power. Sometimes the best way to protect something is to make it bigger than yourself, to give it a purpose that can't be dismissed or manipulated. That afternoon, I drove into town and parked outside the offices of the Regional Veterans Support Foundation. It was a modest building on Elm Street, sandwiched between a big hardware store and a used bookshop, with a simple sign and an American flag hanging limp in the still air. Inside, a receptionist directed me to the office of Director Sarah Chen, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the kind of steady gaze that came from years of helping people navigate bureaucracy and grief. "Mr. Dalton," she said, rising to shake my hand, "what can I do for you?" "I want to make a donation," I said, "a substantial one." Sarah gestured for me to sit. "That's wonderful. What kind of donation did you have in mind?" I pulled out the folder of documents I'd prepared. "I wanted to donate my house, 43 acres of lakefront property, fully paid for, with a condition attached." Her eyebrows rose. "What kind of condition?" "I retain lifetime usage rights. The foundation owns the property, but I continue to live there as long as I'm able. After my death, it becomes a retreat center for veterans and their families." Sarah studied the papers I'd handed her. "Mr. Dalton, this is an extraordinary gift, but I have to ask, why now? What's prompting this decision?" I told her about David's attempts to take over my home, about Gerald and Patricia's schemes, about the APS report and the ongoing pressure to abandon everything Caroline and I had built together. "They want me to believe I'm a burden," I said, "that keeping my home is selfish, that I should give it up for their convenience. But if the house serves a larger purpose, if it helps veterans who've sacrificed for their country, then it becomes something they can't dismiss or diminish. Sarah nodded slowly. It's a brilliant strategy, but Mr. Dalton, are you sure about this? Once you sign the papers, the donation is irrevocable. You'd retain usage rights, but you couldn't sell the property or leave it to your son. That's exactly what I want, I said. David forfeited any claim to this place when he tried to steal it from me. We spent 2 hours reviewing the details. The foundation would assume ownership immediately, gaining a valuable asset for their programs while I retained all the practical benefits of ownership. The legal structure would make it impossible for David or anyone else to challenge my right to live there. And after my death, the property would serve veterans for generations to come. There's one more thing, I said as we finished. I want this donation to be public. Press release, newspaper coverage, maybe even a ceremony. I want everyone to know what this property will become. Sarah smiled. I think we can arrange that. The press conference was scheduled for the following Friday. Sarah had contacted the local newspaper, the Veterans newsletter, and even a regional television station. By Thursday evening, my phone was ringing with requests for interviews and background information. David called that night, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Dad, what the hell do you think you're doing? I'm making a donation to charity, I said mildly. I thought you'd be proud. You can't just give away my inheritance. It was never your inheritance, David. It was mine to do with as I pleased. And it pleases me to make sure veterans have a place to heal. This is insane. You're throwing away millions of dollars just to spite me. I'm not throwing away anything. I'm giving it purpose. Dad, please, let's sit down and talk about this. I'm sure we can work something out. The time for talking was 3 months ago, when you ambushed me on my own porch. You made your choice then. Now I'm making mine. The ceremony took place on a brilliant November morning, with the lake sparkling behind us like scattered diamonds. Sarah had arranged for a small podium on the lawn, facing the water, with chairs for the gathered veterans, local officials, and media representatives. I wore the navy blue suit Caroline had bought me for David's wedding, the one I'd packed away after her funeral because it held too many memories. Today felt like the right time to bring it out again. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, we're here to celebrate an extraordinary act of generosity. Frank Dalton has donated his beloved home and 43 acres of pristine lakefront property to the Regional Veterans Support Foundation, with the stipulation that it become a healing retreat for veterans and their families. The applause was warm and genuine. I saw Tom Bailey in the audience, along with Pete Kowalski and several other neighbors who'd come to show support. Marcus Henderson stood near the back, beaming with professional pride at the legal structure we'd created. When Sarah introduced me, I walked to the podium and looked out at the gathered crowd. Beyond them, the house rose like a testament to 32 years of marriage, every board and beam crafted with love and intention. My wife Caroline and I built this house together, I began. We raised our son here, celebrated anniversaries here, weathered storms both literal and figurative. Caroline died 3 years ago, but her spirit lives on in every room, every garden bed, every tree we planted together. I paused, seeing David's black SUV parked at the edge of the crowd. He stood beside it, arms crossed, face dark with anger. Some people believe that when you get old, you should give up the things that matter to you, that holding on to memories is selfish, that protecting what you've built is stubborn. But I believe that some things are worth fighting for, and some places are too sacred to be sacrificed for convenience. More applause. David's jaw tightened. So, today, I'm ensuring that this house will serve a purpose greater than my own comfort. Veterans who have sacrificed for our freedom will find healing here. Families struggling with the wounds of war will find peace, and Caroline's spirit will live on in service to those who have served us all. The crowd rose to their feet, applauding with real enthusiasm. Sarah presented me with a plaque commemorating the donation, and several veterans approached to shake my hand and thank me for my generosity. David waited until the crowd began to disperse before approaching. His face was pale with rage, his hands clenched into fists. "You think you're so clever," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But this isn't over. I'll challenge this in court. I'll have you declared incompetent. You'll do what?" I interrupted. "Tell a judge that I'm mentally unstable for donating millions of dollars to help veterans? Explain to the media why you're trying to reverse a charitable donation that's already received public recognition?" David opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he had no response. "The house is gone, David," I said quietly. "Not sold, not stolen, but transformed into something bigger than either of us. You can't fight the Veterans Foundation without looking like exactly what you are, a greedy son trying to steal from heroes." Madison appeared at David's elbow, her face drawn with stress. "Frank, surely there's some way to work this out." "There is," I said. "You can accept that your housing problem isn't my responsibility to solve. You can find your own place to live, with your own resources, like adults." Gerald and Patricia emerged from behind the SUV, both looking defeated. Gerald's schemes and manipulations meant nothing now, that the property was owned by a respected charity. Patricia's complaints about my stubbornness would fall on deaf ears when directed at a man who'd just made a multi-million-dollar donation to veterans. "This is your final answer?" David asked. "This is my only answer," I replied. They drove away without another word, leaving me standing on the lawn of the house that was still mine to live in, but no longer mine to lose. The irony was perfect. By giving it away, I'd protected it more completely than any lock or legal document ever could. Sarah Chen approached as I watched them disappear around the bend. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Like I just won a war without firing a shot," I said. That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade, Caroline's recipe, tart and sweet in perfect balance, and watched the sun set over water that now belonged to America's veterans. The house behind me creaked with familiar sounds, but they felt different now. Not the groans of a structure under siege, but the satisfied sighs of a building that had found its true purpose. My phone rang once, around 9 o'clock. David's number. I let it go to voicemail and deleted the message without listening to it. Whatever he had to say, I'd already heard enough. The war was over, and I'd won it by transforming the battlefield itself. David had wanted to steal my house, so I'd made it unstealable. He'd wanted to control my life, so I'd put it beyond his reach forever. Most importantly, I'd kept my promise to Caroline. The house would remain exactly as she'd left it, but now it would serve a purpose that honored both her memory and the sacrifice of those who'd served our country. It was, I thought, exactly what she would have wanted, exactly what we both would have chosen if we'd been given the chance to choose together. The lake lapped gently against the shoreline, and somewhere in the distance, a loon called its wild, lonely song. But I wasn't lonely anymore. I was home, surrounded by memories and purpose, protected by the kind of strategic thinking that comes from 72 years of learning when to bend and when to break. David had forgotten the most important lesson I'd ever tried to teach him, that some things matter more than money, and some fights are worth whatever they cost. He'd learned that lesson now, whether he wanted to or not, the hard way, as always. But that was his choice, not mine. I'd made my choice 3 months ago, standing on this same porch, listening to 4 people tell me how they planned to rearrange my life for their convenience. I'd chosen to fight back, and I'd won. Part 7. The quiet, after winter came early that year, arriving in December with the kind of bitter cold that makes you grateful for a well-built house and a reliable furnace. I'd always loved this season at the lake. The way snow transformed the familiar landscape into something pristine and otherworldly, the silence that settled over everything like a blessing. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't dreading the holidays. The donation had been finalized in early December, with all the legal formalities completed and the transfer of ownership recorded with the county. Sarah Chen had been true to her word about publicity. The story had been picked up by regional newspapers and even a veterans magazine, generating donations and support for the Foundation's programs. I'd received dozens of letters from veterans and their families, thanking me for the gift and sharing their own stories of healing and loss. Each one reminded me that Caroline's vision, that this place could serve something larger than ourselves, had been exactly right. David hadn't called since the press conference. Neither had Madison, Gerald, or Patricia. It was as if they'd simply vanished from my life, leaving behind only the memory of their presumption and the satisfaction of having outmaneuvered them completely. But I knew better than to think it was truly over. Men like Gerald don't give up easily, especially when they're desperate, and David's pride had been wounded in a very public way. Wounded pride, in my experience, tends to fester. The first sign of their next move came just before Christmas, in the form of a certified letter delivered by a very apologetic postal worker who had to trudge through 6 inches of fresh snow to reach my door. The envelope bore the letterhead of Cranshaw, Medford and Associates, a law firm in the county seat that specialized in estate planning and family disputes. Inside was a formal legal document that made my blood pressure spike despite all my mental preparation. Petition for guardianship and conservatorship, read the heading, followed by dense paragraphs of legal language that boiled down to a simple claim: that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs and required court-appointed supervision. The petition, filed by David Edward Dalton and Gerald Monroe as co-petitioners, alleged that I was suffering from age-related cognitive decline, evidenced by increasingly erratic behavior, including the recent disposal of valuable assets without proper consideration of their impact on family members who had reasonable expectation of inheritance. In other words, they were claiming that my donation to the Veterans Foundation proved I was senile. It was clever, I had to admit. By framing my strategic victory as evidence of mental incompetence, they were trying to use my own success against me. If they could convince a judge that I'd given away millions of dollars because I was no longer thinking clearly, they might be able to reverse the donation and assume control of my finances. I called Marcus immediately. "I expected something like this," he said after I'd read him the petition. "It's a Hail Mary pass, but it's not without precedent. There have been cases where large charitable donations were reversed on competency grounds. What are our chances? Good, but not guaranteed. They'll need to prove cognitive impairment through medical testimony, and we'll need to demonstrate that the donation was the result of clear thinking and careful planning. The fact that you worked with me for months on the legal structure helps our case considerably. When's the hearing?" "January 15th. That gives us 3 weeks to prepare. Frank, I'm going to recommend we get you evaluated by a neuropsychologist, someone who can provide expert testimony about your cognitive function." The next few weeks were a blur of medical appointments, legal consultations, and document preparation. The neuropsychological evaluation took most of a day, hours of tests measuring memory, reasoning, problem-solving, and decision-making capacity. The psychologist, Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, was thorough and professional, putting me through exercises that reminded me of the SATs I'd taken 55 years ago. "Mr. Dalton," she said as we finished, "I want you to know that your cognitive function is well within normal limits for someone your age. In fact, your performance on several tests was superior to the average for your demographic." "So, I'm not senile?" She smiled. "Not even close. Your decision-making capacity is intact, your memory is excellent, and your reasoning skills are sharp. If anyone suggests otherwise, they'll have to explain away a very comprehensive evaluation." Meanwhile, Marcus had been conducting his own investigation into David and Gerald's motivations. What he had found was even more damaging to their case than I'd hoped. "Gerald's in worse financial trouble than we thought," Marcus reported during one of our strategy sessions. "He owes back taxes, has judgments against him from 3 different creditors, and is facing foreclosure on what little property he still owns. The man is desperate. And David's been making some poor business decisions lately. His consulting firm lost 2 major clients last quarter, and he's had to take out a second mortgage to cover operating expenses. He needs money, Frank, and he sees your property as his salvation. So, this isn't just about housing Patricia and Gerald anymore. I don't think it ever was. I think Gerald identified you as a potential target months ago, and David was either complicit from the beginning or got drawn in later. Either way, they're not just trying to take your house. They're trying to take control of all your assets." The hearing was held on a gray January morning in the courthouse where Caroline and I had gotten our marriage license 47 years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat in the same building where we'd once promised to love and cherish each other until death, now fighting to preserve what we'd built together. David sat at the plaintiff's table with Gerald and their attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Jennifer Cranshaw, who looked like she'd been bred for courtroom combat. They'd clearly spent money they didn't have on legal representation, which told me everything I needed to know about how much they stood to gain if they won. Marcus had prepared our case meticulously. We had Dr. Reeves's comprehensive evaluation, testimony from Sarah Chen about the thoughtful planning that had gone into the donation, and statements from neighbors and community members attesting to my competence and stability. But Cranshaw was good at her job. She opened with a narrative that painted me as a lonely, confused old man who'd been manipulated into making a devastating financial decision. "Your Honor," she said, Mr. Dalton has given away property worth over $2 million to strangers, leaving nothing for the family who've cared for him and supported him through his wife's death. This isn't the behavior of a man thinking clearly, it's the behavior of someone whose judgment has been compromised by grief and age. She called David as her first witness. My son took the stand wearing the same charcoal suit he'd worn to ambush me on my porch, his expression a carefully crafted mixture of sorrow and concern. "I've been worried about Dad for months," he testified. "Since Mom died, he's become increasingly isolated, suspicious of family members who try to help him. The donation to the Veterans Organization was completely out of character. Dad was always careful with money, always thinking about the future. To give away everything without consulting family suggests someone who's not thinking clearly. It was masterfully done. Every word technically true, but twisted to support their narrative. Yes, I'd become more selective about who I trusted, because I'd learned the hard way that trust could be weaponized. Yes, the donation had been a major financial decision, because it needed to be, to protect what mattered most." Gerald took the stand next, presenting himself as a concerned family member who had only wanted to help. He testified about my paranoid behavior and my refusal to accept reasonable assistance with property maintenance. He made my strategic preparations sound like the delusions of a man losing touch with reality, but Marcus was ready for them. Dr. Reeves took the stand and methodically destroyed their competency argument. She walked the judge through her evaluation results, explaining in clear, professional language that I showed no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished decision-making capacity. "In my professional opinion," she concluded, "Mr. Dalton's decision to donate his property represents exactly the kind of complex, forward-thinking planning you'd expect from someone with intact cognitive function. The legal structure he created, the consultation with attorneys and financial advisors, the consideration of long-term consequences, all of this demonstrates clear thinking and sound judgment." Sarah Chen testified about our months of planning, the detailed discussions we'd had about the property's future use, the careful consideration I had given to every aspect of the donation. She made it clear that this hadn't been an impulsive decision by a confused old man, but a thoughtful choice by someone who understood exactly what he was doing. Marcus called Tom Bailey as a character witness, and several other neighbors who testified about my continued competence and active involvement in community affairs. He presented financial records showing that I'd managed my money responsibly throughout the entire period when David and Gerald claimed I was declining. But the most effective moment came when Marcus called me to testify on my own behalf. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "can you explain to the court why you chose to donate your property to the Veterans Foundation?" I looked directly at the judge, a woman about Marcus's age who had been listening intently throughout the proceedings. "Your Honor, my wife and I built that house together over 32 years of marriage. It represents everything we worked for, everything we valued. When she died, I promised her I'd protect what we'd created together." I paused, gathering my thoughts. My son and his in-laws wanted me to give up my home so they could live there rent-free. They wanted me to move into an 8x10 room and watch while they redecorated the kitchen my wife designed, dug up the garden where her ashes are scattered, and turned our sanctuary into their personal real estate investment. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "So, I made a choice. I chose to give the property a purpose that honors my wife's memory and serves people who've sacrificed for our country. Veterans who've lost limbs, lost friends, lost their sense of peace. They'll find healing in the place where Caroline and I found happiness." I looked at David then, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "That's not the decision of a man who's lost his mind, Your Honor. That's the decision of a man who knows exactly what matters and isn't afraid to fight for it." The judge retired to consider her decision, leaving us to wait in the courthouse hallway. David avoided eye contact, standing with Gerald and their attorney in a tight cluster near the windows. I could see them whispering urgently, probably discussing their next move if this gambit failed. Marcus sat beside me on one of the wooden benches that had been installed when the courthouse was built in 1923, both of us quiet with the weight of what we'd just experienced. "How do you think it went?" I asked. "I think we made our case," he said. "But judges can be unpredictable when family relationships are involved." 20 minutes later, we were called back into the courtroom. The judge had returned to her bench, her expression giving nothing away. "After considering all the testimony and evidence presented," she began, I find that the petitioners have failed to demonstrate that Mr. Dalton lacks the mental capacity to manage his own affairs. Relief flooded through me like cool water. The medical testimony clearly establishes that Mr. Dalton is competent to make his own decisions. The donation to the Veterans Foundation, while certainly substantial, was made after careful planning and consultation with legal counsel. There is no evidence that it represents anything other than a considered choice by a man exercising his right to dispose of his property as he sees fit. The judge's gaze moved to David and Gerald. Furthermore, the court notes that the petitioners appear to have significant financial motivations for seeking control of Mr. Dalton's assets. This raises serious questions about their true intentions and undermines their credibility as concerned family members. David's face had gone pale. The petition for guardianship and conservatorship is denied in its entirety. Mr. Dalton retains full legal capacity and control over his affairs. This court will not entertain any future petitions regarding Mr. Dalton's competency without clear and compelling new evidence of cognitive decline. It was over, completely, decisively, finally over. David and Gerald filed out of the courtroom without speaking to me, their attorney gathering papers with the brisk efficiency of someone already planning their bill. I sat in the sudden quiet, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. "Congratulations," Marcus said quietly. "You won." Outside the courthouse, the January air was sharp and clean, carrying the promise of snow. I stood on the steps where Caroline and I had posed for pictures after our wedding, breathing deeply and feeling lighter than I had in months. My phone buzzed with a text message. Sarah Chen. "Heard about the hearing. Congratulations. Can't wait to start planning our veteran retreat programs." I smiled and typed back, "The house is ready when you are." Because it was true. The house was ready, not just as a building, but as a symbol of something larger than any individual ownership. David and Gerald had tried to reduce it to dollars and square footage, to treat it as just another asset to be claimed and managed. But they'd forgotten that some things can't be reduced to their monetary value. Some places hold meanings that transcend property law and inheritance rights. The lake house would serve veterans, not because I was feeling charitable, but because that's what Caroline would have wanted. Because that's what the place itself demanded, to be more than a private retreat, to serve a purpose worthy of the love that had built it. David had lost more than a court case today. He'd lost the last chance to be the son Caroline and I had tried to raise, the last opportunity to choose family over greed, love over calculation. That was his decision to make, and he'd made it. Now I could get on with the business of living the life I'd chosen, in the house I'd protected, surrounded by memories that no court proceeding could touch. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything I needed to be happy. The snow began to fall as I drove home, soft flakes that would blanket the lake in pristine white, and remind me once again that some things endure, some things matter, and some fights are worth whatever they cost. I'd fought for what mattered most, and I'd won. The rest was just living, and I intended to do plenty of that.